My friend, one of the greatest struggles we face in life is the temptation to move ahead of God. We get impatient. We want answers now. We want doors to open immediately. And when things don't happen in our timing, we try to force them ourselves. But hear me. When I say this, God's timing is never late, never early. It is always perfect. God's timing is perfect. And that truth is something we must settle deep within our hearts if we are going to walk in step with His will. Far too often we allow our own impatience, desires, and limited understanding to dictate our actions, leading us down a path of unnecessary struggle and hardship. But when we fully grasp that God sees the end from the beginning, that He orchestrates every detail with divine precision, we can learn to rest in His timing rather than fight against it. One of the greatest challenges we face as believers is trusting God when we do not see immediate results. We live in a fast-paced world where instant gratification has become the norm. We expect quick answers, immediate solutions, and rapid progress. But God does not operate according to human timelines. He is not bound by our schedules or pressured by our deadlines. Instead, He works in ways that align with His eternal purpose, shaping us, preparing us, and positioning us for His best. When we look at the Bible, we see countless examples of men and women who had to wait on God's timing. Abraham was promised a son, but years passed before Isaac was born. Joseph had a vision of leadership, yet he endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before stepping into his God-ordained position. David was anointed as king long before he ever sat on the throne. And even Jesus, the Son of God, waited 30 years before beginning his public ministry. Every one of these individuals had moments where they could have doubted, questioned, or taken matters into their own hands. But in each case, God was working behind the scenes, preparing them for the fulfillment of His promises. What we must understand is that God's timing is not just about the right moment, it's about the right process. He is not only preparing the blessing for us, but He is preparing us for the blessing. There are things God needs to develop in us before He allows us to step into certain seasons of our lives. Sometimes He is strengthening our faith. Other times He is teaching us patience, humility, or wisdom. He may be orchestrating circumstances, aligning people, or removing obstacles that we cannot even see. The challenge for us is to remain faithful in the waiting. It is during these seasons of delay that the enemy often tries to plant seeds of doubt in our hearts. He whispers lies, telling us that God has forgotten us, that nothing is happening, that we must take matters into our own hands. But when we move ahead of God, we step out of alignment with His will, and we risk delaying or even forfeiting the blessings He has for us. God's timing is not about withholding something from us. It is about giving us His very best at the appointed time. If we rush ahead, we may settle for something that is less than what He intended. If we try to force doors open, we may walk into situations we were never meant to be in. But if we trust Him, if we rest in the assurance that He is in control, we will see His faithfulness unfold in ways beyond our imagination. Every delay has a purpose. Every waiting season is an opportunity to grow, to deepen our trust, and to surrender our plans fully to Him. Instead of seeing delays as obstacles, we must begin to see them as divine appointments, moments where God is working in ways we cannot yet understand. Our responsibility is not to control the timing, but to remain obedient, prayerful, and expectant, knowing that He will bring His promises to pass in the moment. Impatience is one of the greatest obstacles to fully trusting in God's perfect plan. When we move ahead of Him, we often find ourselves entangled in unnecessary struggles, delays, and consequences that could have been avoided if we had simply waited for His guidance. The desire for quick results and immediate gratification can lead us to make choices that are based on our emotions rather than on God's wisdom. From the very beginning, human nature has been marked by impatience. We see it in the story of Adam and Eve, who, instead of trusting God's provision, took matters into their own hands and ate from the forbidden tree. Their impatience led to consequences that affected all of humanity. In another example, Abraham and Sarah received a promise from God that they would have a son, but when years passed without a child, Sarah took things into her own hands. She urged Abraham to have a child with Hagar, her maidservant, and the result was Ishmael. While Ishmael was not outside of God's awareness, he was not the promised child, and their impatience caused unnecessary conflict and division in their household. Impatience leads to poor decisions because it shifts our focus from God's plan to our own limited understanding. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. But when we grow weary of waiting, we often do the opposite. We lean on our own understanding, make impulsive decisions, and then find ourselves asking God to fix the mess we created. The consequences of impatience are not just spiritual. They affect every area of our lives. In relationships, impatience can cause us to settle for the wrong person instead of waiting for the one God has prepared for us. In career decisions, it can push us to take opportunities that look good on the surface but are not aligned with God's calling. In financial matters, impatience can lead to unwise spending, debt, or risky investments because we want immediate results instead of trusting God's provision. One of the greatest dangers of impatience is that it often leads to compromise. When we refuse to wait on God, we start justifying decisions that go against His word. We convince ourselves that we need to act now, that we cannot afford to wait any longer. But whenever we move ahead of God, we step outside of His protection and wisdom, exposing ourselves to unnecessary hardships. The enemy knows that impatience is a weakness for many of us, and he uses it as a weapon to distract and discourage us. He will tempt us with shortcuts that seem easier, faster, and more convenient. He will make us question whether God is really going to come through. But just because something happens quickly does not mean it is from God. Not every open door is an open door from Him, and not every delay is a denial. God's timing is always for our good. When He asks us to wait, it is because He is preparing something greater than we could imagine. There are times when He is protecting us from unseen dangers. There are times when He is refining our character so that we will be ready to handle the blessings He wants to give us. And there are times when He is aligning circumstances in ways that we cannot yet see. But one thing is certain, when we take things into our own hands, we often make the journey harder than it needs to be. Patience is not just about waiting, it is about trusting. It is about believing that what God has for us is worth the wait. Instead of allowing impatience to lead us into mistakes, we must learn to submit to His timing, knowing that when we wait on Him, we will always receive His best. Faith is not just believing that God exists, it is trusting Him enough to wait on His timing. Waiting is one of the hardest tests of faith because it requires us to surrender. Control, to resist the urge to act on our own, and to remain steadfast even when nothing seems to be happening. True faith is demonstrated in stillness, when we choose to be patient and trust that God is working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see it. Many people believe that faith is about moving forward, about taking action. While faith certainly involves obedience, it also requires knowing when to be still. Psalm 46:10 reminds us, "Be still and know that I am God." Being still does not mean doing nothing. It means placing our full confidence in God's plan and not rushing ahead of Him. It means understanding that His delays are not denials and that He is working everything out according to His perfect will. In the Bible, we see a powerful example of waiting in faith through the story of Moses and the Israelites at the Red Sea. After being freed from Egypt, the Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's approaching army and the waters of the Red Sea. Panic set in, and they cried out in fear. But Moses told them in Exodus 14:13-14, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." They had no power to change their situation, but in their stillness, God performed a miracle. He parted the sea and led them to safety. Waiting on God does not mean we are abandoned. It does not mean that nothing is happening. It means God is working on something greater than we can understand in the moment. When we are forced to wait, it is often because God is preparing us, strengthening us, or setting things in order for His perfect plan to unfold. The problem is that our human nature resists waiting. We want things immediately, and when they don't happen according to our schedule, we start to doubt. But faith means believing that God is at work, even when we cannot see any progress. Abraham's life is another example of waiting in faith. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, yet years passed without a child. As time went on, the situation looked impossible. He and Sarah were beyond childbearing age. But Romans 4:20-21 tells us, "Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised." Abraham's faith was not in what he could see, it was in what God had spoken. And in the end, God fulfilled his promise, proving once again that his timing is perfect. One of the greatest challenges we face in waiting is the temptation to take matters into our own hands. When we do not see immediate results, we start looking for alternatives, thinking that maybe we need to help God bring His plan to pass. But when we step outside of His timing, we open the door to unnecessary struggles. It is far better to wait in faith than to rush ahead and create problems that could have been avoided. Stillness in faith does not mean passivity. It means trusting God's process. It means using the waiting season to pray, to grow, and to prepare for what He has in store. The enemy will try to convince us that nothing is happening, that God has forgotten us, or that we must act now or miss our opportunity. But faith silences those doubts and says, God's plan will unfold in His perfect time, and I will trust Him no matter what. Patience is not just a virtue, it is a form of protection. When God tells us to wait, it is not because He is denying us something, it is because He is shielding us from something. Moving too quickly can lead us into situations we are not ready for, relationships that are not meant for us, and opportunities that look good but are not part of God's plan. That is why patience is so important. It keeps us under God's covering and prevents us from stepping outside of His will. Many times we think waiting means inactivity, but that is not true. Waiting on God is an active process. It requires trust, discipline, and obedience. It means resisting the urge to take matters into our own hands. It means believing that even when we do not see progress, God is still working behind the scenes. The enemy wants us to become impatient so that we will make hasty decisions. He wants us to grow frustrated with God's timing so that we will move ahead without divine direction. But patience teaches us to remain still until God gives us the green light. One of the greatest examples of patience bringing protection is seen in the life of Moses. When Moses was young, he knew that God had called him to deliver the Israelites from slavery. But instead of waiting for God's timing, he took matters into his own hands and killed an Egyptian. Because of his impatience, he had to flee Egypt and spend 40 years in the wilderness before he was ready for his true assignment. If Moses had waited for God's timing, he would have avoided years of exile and hardship. But even in his mistake, God was merciful and used the waiting period to prepare him for his destiny. That is what patience does. It prepares us. Sometimes the delay is not about the situation, it is about us. God knows when we are ready, and He will not give us something before we are mature enough to handle it. A child may beg for the keys to a car, but a loving parent will not hand them over until the child is ready. Not because the parent is being cruel, but because the parent understands the danger of giving something too soon. The same is true for God. He loves us too much to release us into something we are not prepared for. There are times when impatience leads to disaster. In 1 Samuel 13, King Saul found himself in a difficult situation. The Philistine army was preparing to attack and the people were growing anxious. The prophet Samuel had told Saul to wait for him to come and offer a sacrifice before going into battle. But when Samuel did not arrive as quickly as Saul expected, Saul took matters into his own hands and performed the sacrifice himself. That single act of impatience cost him the kingdom. Because he moved ahead of God's timing, he lost the favor and protection that came with obedience. How many times do we find ourselves in the same situation? We grow impatient, we feel pressure to act, and instead of waiting on God, we move ahead on our own. But when we do, we step outside of His covering. The blessing we were waiting for turns into a burden because we did not wait for God's timing. The relationship we rushed into becomes a source of pain. The opportunity we forced open brings unnecessary struggles, all because we didn't trust that God's timing was protecting us. God is not withholding blessings from you. He is shielding you from harm. He sees what you cannot see. He knows the dangers that lie ahead. What looks like a delay is actually divine protection. The closed doors, the unanswered prayers, the seasons of waiting, they are all part of His plan to keep you safe. If we truly trust God, we must trust His timing. We must believe that when the time is right, He will open the right doors, bring the right people, and lead us to the right place. Until then, patience is our shield. It keeps us in alignment with His will and secures us under His protection. Obedience to God is not just about following rules, it is about positioning ourselves to receive His best. When we obey God's instructions, we align ourselves with His divine plan, and that alignment opens the door to His blessings. Many people want to experience God's favor, but they are unwilling to submit to His timing and direction. However, the truth is that obedience and blessing go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. Throughout the Bible, we see that every great move of God is preceded by obedience. From Abraham leaving his homeland to the Israelites marching around Jericho, blessings always follow obedience. It is not enough to pray for God's will. We must also be willing to follow it, even when it does not make sense, even when it requires waiting, and even when it challenges us. One of the most powerful examples of obedience unlocking blessings is found in the story of Peter. In Luke 5, Peter and his fellow fishermen had been working all night and caught nothing. They were exhausted, discouraged, and ready to give up. Then Jesus stepped into Peter's boat and told him to go out into the deep and cast his nets again. Now, from a logical standpoint, this made no sense. Peter was an experienced fisherman. He knew the waters, and he knew that if they hadn't caught anything all night, trying again in the same place seemed pointless. But instead of arguing, instead of leaning on his own understanding, Peter responded with obedience. He said, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." Luke 5:05. That simple act of obedience led to a miraculous blessing. Peter and his crew caught so many fish that their nets began to break and they had to call for help. If Peter had relied on his own logic, he would have missed out on what God had for him. But because he obeyed, he received an overflow of blessing. This story teaches us an important truth. Blessings are often waiting on the other side of obedience. Sometimes God asks us to do things that don't make sense in the natural. He may tell us to wait when we feel ready to move. He may tell us to take a step of faith when we feel unprepared. He may close a door that we desperately wanted open. In those moments, we have a choice. Will we trust Him or will we follow our own desires? True obedience is not about convenience. It is about faith. It is about believing that God knows what is best even when we don't understand. Abraham is another powerful example of obedience unlocking blessings. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, but years passed and he and Sarah remained childless. When the promise finally came to pass and Isaac was born, God tested Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his son. This request must have been heartbreaking and confusing. Isaac was the child of promise, the fulfillment of what God had spoken, but Abraham didn't hesitate. He obeyed God and prepared to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. At the last moment, God provided a ram in place of Isaac. And because of Abraham's obedience, God reaffirmed His covenant and blessed him beyond measure. What if Abraham had refused to obey? What if Peter had ignored Jesus' instructions? What if the Israelites had refused to march around Jericho? Their disobedience would have cost them the very blessings God had prepared for them. The same is true in our lives. Every time we delay obedience, we delay our blessing. When we follow God's instructions, even when they don't make sense, we position ourselves for His favor. Obedience requires trust. It requires us to surrender our plans, our timing, and our expectations to God. But when we do, we experience His best. Many times we pray for blessings, but we ignore the instructions that lead to them. We ask God to move in our lives, but we refuse to follow the steps He has laid out. But God's blessings are not random. They are connected to obedience. When we walk in alignment with Him, He opens doors that no man can shut. He provides in ways we never expected, and He leads us to places we never imagined. One of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that delay means denial. We pray for something, and when we don't see immediate results, we assume God has forgotten us. But delay is often a sign that God is still working behind the scenes. He is aligning the right people, the right circumstances, and the right opportunities to ensure that His plan unfolds perfectly. If He gives us something too soon, we might mishandle it, misuse it, or not fully appreciate it. But when we receive it in His perfect timing, it becomes a true blessing instead of a burden. Think about Joseph in the Bible. As a young man, God gave him dreams of greatness. He saw visions of himself in a position of power, but instead of rising immediately to prominence, Joseph was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned. For years, it seemed like everything was going wrong, but what looked like a delay was actually God's preparation. During that time, Joseph developed the character, wisdom, and leadership skills needed to handle the position God had for him. If Joseph had gone straight from the dream to the throne, he wouldn't have been ready. But because he waited, he was able to step into his destiny at exactly the right time. Many of us are in the waiting phase right now. We feel stuck, overlooked, or forgotten. We see others moving forward while we remain in the same place. But what we don't realize is that waiting is a form of divine positioning. God is working behind the scenes, shaping us, molding us, and refining us so that when the time comes, we will be ready. Waiting is not punishment, it is preparation. There is danger in moving too soon. The Bible tells us about King Saul, a man who was anointed but lacked patience. In 1 Samuel 13, Saul was preparing for battle against the Philistines, and he was instructed to wait for the prophet Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice. But when Samuel was delayed, Saul grew impatient. He took matters into his own hands and offered the sacrifice himself. That one act of disobedience cost him everything. Because he refused to wait on God's timing, he lost his kingdom. How often do we make the same mistake? We feel like time is running out, so we settle, we compromise, we rush into relationships, jobs, or decisions that God never intended for us, and later we find ourselves dealing with unnecessary pain and regret. But if we had just waited, if we had trusted that God's timing was perfect, we would have received His best instead of settling for something less.